My parents refused to treat my diabetes because God will heal the faithful. My ex-Mormon uncle saved my life, and now they want custody of my son. I was 12 years old when I started drinking water constantly and losing weight no matter how much I ate. My parents watched me get thinner and weaker for weeks, while insisting that prayer and fasting would cure whatever spiritual ailment was causing my symptoms. They belonged to a fundamentalist Mormon sect that believed modern medicine showed a lack of faith in God's healing power. When I collapsed during morning prayers and couldn't wake up for 6 hours, they finally called the church elders instead of 911. Elder Whitmore arrived with 3 other men from the leadership council while I lay unconscious on the living room floor. They formed a circle around me and began what they called a healing blessing, placing their hands on my head and speaking in tongues while my blood sugar climbed to levels that should have killed me. My mother knelt beside them weeping and asking God to forgive whatever sins had brought this illness into their righteous household. My father stood in the corner reciting scriptures about faith moving mountains. What none of them knew was that my Uncle Nathan had been watching from outside through the window. He'd been excommunicated from the church 5 years earlier for questioning doctrine and asking too many uncomfortable questions about the prophet's financial dealings. My parents had forbidden any contact with him, calling him an apostate who would poison my mind with worldly ideas. But Nathan had never stopped loving me, and he'd been driving by our house every few days just to catch glimpses of me playing in the yard. Nathan saw the church elders' cars parked outside and knew something was wrong when he spotted me lying motionless through the living room window. He called 911 from his cell phone while watching the healing ritual continue inside. When paramedics arrived 8 minutes later, my blood glucose level was over 800 milligrams per deciliter. Normal levels range between 80 and 120. The EMT told my parents I would have died within hours without immediate medical intervention. My body was already shutting down from diabetic ketoacidosis. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed type 1 diabetes and explained that my pancreas had stopped producing insulin completely. This wasn't caused by diet or lifestyle choices, but by an autoimmune condition that destroys insulin-producing cells. Without daily insulin injections, I would die. The endocrinologist spent 2 hours teaching my parents how to check blood sugar, calculate carbohydrate ratios, and administer insulin shots. They listened with obvious reluctance, frequently asking if there were natural alternatives to pharmaceutical medications. My parents brought me home with a bag full of medical supplies and a detailed care plan from the hospital. But once we were alone, my father gathered all the insulin vials, test strips, and glucose meters into a cardboard box. He carried everything to the backyard fire pit and burned it all while reciting prayers about trusting in God's providence rather than man's inventions. My mother watched the flames consume my life-saving medications, while nodding in agreement about the importance of faith over fear. Within 3 days, I was sick again, with the same symptoms that had nearly killed me before. Extreme thirst, frequent urination, rapid weight loss, and crushing fatigue that made it impossible to stay awake during the day. My parents increased their prayer sessions and added longer fasting periods to help purify my spirit. They invited church members to our house for group healing sessions where dozens of people would lay hands on me while speaking in tongues and rebuking the demon of illness. By the end of that week, I was too weak to get out of bed. My vision had become so blurry, I couldn't read the scriptures my mother left on my nightstand. I stopped eating completely because food made me vomit immediately, and I could barely drink water without throwing up within minutes. My parents interpreted these worsening symptoms as signs that God was testing our family's faith more severely. They increased their prayers and enlisted the entire congregation to fast on my behalf. Uncle Nathan had been calling our house repeatedly, but my parents refused to let him speak with me. He'd heard through extended family members that I was sick again and suspected my parents had stopped my medical treatment. On Sunday morning, while my family was at church participating in special healing prayers for me, Nathan used the spare key hidden under our garden gnome to enter the house. He found me barely conscious in my bedroom, breathing rapidly and unable to focus my eyes. Nathan carried me to his truck and drove straight to the emergency room while calling ahead to warn them about my diabetic history. The hospital staff recognized me immediately from my previous admission just 2 weeks earlier. My blood sugar had climbed even higher this time, reaching dangerous levels that caused severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. The doctor told Nathan that another few hours without treatment would have sent me into a diabetic coma that could have caused permanent brain damage or death. While I was stabilized in the ICU, Nathan called Child Protective Services to report medical neglect. He explained how my parents had destroyed my prescribed medications and were relying on prayer instead of insulin to treat my life-threatening condition. CPS opened an emergency investigation and placed me in Nathan's temporary custody pending a full hearing. My parents were prohibited from visiting me at the hospital without supervision from social workers who could ensure my medical care continued appropriately. The custody hearing took place 3 weeks later in a courtroom packed with members from my parents' congregation. They'd organized a letter-writing campaign portraying Nathan as a dangerous apostate who was corrupting an innocent child with secular influences. The church leaders testified that prayer and faith had been healing people for thousands of years, while modern medicine was a recent invention that encouraged people to doubt God's power. They argued that removing me from my parents' care violated their religious freedom. Judge Patricia Williams listened to hours of testimony from both sides before reviewing my medical records and the evidence of neglect. She ruled that while my parents had the right to practice their religion, they couldn't exercise that right in ways that endangered my life. The court awarded full custody to Nathan with supervised visitation rights for my parents, contingent on their agreement to maintain my medical treatment. They were also required to complete parenting classes about childhood chronic illness. Living with Nathan was like entering a completely different world, where I was encouraged to ask questions instead of just accepting what adults told me. He taught me how to manage my diabetes independently, checking blood sugar levels and calculating insulin doses based on what I ate. We established routines around mealtimes and medication schedules that made my condition feel manageable rather than overwhelming. Most importantly, he never made me feel ashamed or broken because of my medical needs. My parents appealed the custody decision and spent the next 2 years fighting through various court proceedings. They brought character witnesses from the church who testified about their moral righteousness and dedication to raising children according to God's commandments. They hired lawyers who specialized in religious liberty cases and argued that the state was interfering with their constitutional rights. Every few months, we'd return to court for hearings about visitation schedules or attempts to modify the custody arrangement. During this time, Nathan helped me understand the difference between faith and fanaticism. He'd grown up in the same religious community as my parents, but had gradually realized that some interpretations of Scripture were harmful rather than helpful. He showed me how to research different theological perspectives and encouraged me to think critically about religious teachings. He never tried to destroy my faith, but he taught me that asking questions could strengthen rather than weaken my relationship with God. As I grew older and my diabetes management became more sophisticated, my parents occasionally attempted to undermine my medical care during supervised visits. They would make comments about how I was becoming too dependent on medications and suggest that stronger faith could reduce my need for insulin. The social worker overseeing our visits documented these conversations and reported them to the court. Each incident resulted in additional restrictions on my parents' access and mandatory counseling sessions about medical compliance. When I turned 16, I was legally old enough to have more input into custody decisions. My parents petitioned the court for expanded visitation rights, arguing that I was now mature enough to make my own choices about religious practice and medical care. They brought letters from church members describing their spiritual growth and renewed commitment to supporting my health needs. The judge agreed to slightly increased visitation, but maintained Nathan's primary custody and all medical decision-making authority. I graduated high school with excellent grades and received a full scholarship to study biochemistry at the state university. My diabetes was well controlled, and I'd learned to navigate the condition so effectively that most people didn't even know I had a chronic illness. Nathan had supported my academic goals and encouraged me to pursue whatever career interested me most. My parents attended my graduation ceremony but sat separately from Nathan and barely acknowledged his role in my success. During my sophomore year of college, I met Elena, a pre-med student whose intelligence and compassion immediately attracted me. We began dating, and I appreciated how naturally she accepted my diabetes management routines without making them feel like obstacles to our relationship. When I told her about my childhood and the custody battles, she was horrified that parents would deny medical care to their own child. Her support helped me process some of the trauma I'd experienced and understand how abnormal my early experiences had been. Elena and I married during our senior year in a small ceremony that Nathan organized in his backyard. My parents attended but insisted on holding a separate blessing ceremony at their church to legitimize our union according to their religious beliefs. I agreed to participate because I wanted them involved in this important milestone, even though their version of the ceremony included prayers asking God to guide me back to the true faith. Elena graciously participated in both celebrations while privately expressing concern about my parents' continued attempts to control my spiritual life. After graduation, I started working at a pharmaceutical company, developing better insulin delivery systems for diabetic patients. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now creating the same type of medications my parents had once burned in our backyard. Elena began medical school with plans to specialize in endocrinology, partly inspired by watching me navigate my condition. We rented a small apartment near her school and settled into routines that accommodated both our career demands and my health management needs. Our son David was born 3 years later, a healthy baby who brought joy to everyone in our extended family. Nathan was thrilled to become a grandfather figure and immediately began planning all the adventures he wanted to share with his grandnephew. Elena's parents flew in from across the country to help during the first few weeks after birth. Even my parents seemed genuinely excited about their new grandchild, though they immediately began making comments about the importance of raising him with proper spiritual guidance. The first few months of David's life were blissful, despite the expected challenges of new parenthood. My diabetes management became more complex with irregular sleep schedules and stress from caring for an infant, but Elena helped monitor my blood sugar and reminded me about medication timing when I was too exhausted to remember. Nathan visited frequently to help with baby care and share his excitement about watching David grow and develop. My parents called regularly to check on their grandson and occasionally visited for supervised afternoon visits. When David was 6 months old, my parents requested expanded visitation rights through their lawyer. They argued that supervised visits were no longer necessary since they demonstrated years of appropriate behavior and had taken parenting classes as required by the court. They wanted overnight visits and the opportunity to take David to church services to begin his spiritual education. The petition also requested that I consider allowing them to provide childcare during work hours since Elena had returned to medical school and we were struggling with daycare costs. I was hesitant about expanding their access to David, remembering how they'd consistently undermined my medical care even during supervised visits. But Nathan encouraged me to consider their request carefully, pointing out that people could change and that David deserved the opportunity to know his grandparents if they were genuinely committed to appropriate boundaries. Elena was more skeptical, worried that my parents would try to influence David against medical treatment if he ever developed health problems. We agreed to a gradual expansion of visitation, starting with longer supervised visits to see how my parents interacted with David. Initially, everything went well. They were loving grandparents who enjoyed playing with David and teaching him simple songs and stories. They followed all guidelines about feeding schedules and safety precautions without complaint. They even asked thoughtful questions about my diabetes management and seemed genuinely interested in understanding how I maintained my health. After 3 months of successful extended visits, the social worker recommended allowing unsupervised afternoon visits with my parents. They were thrilled with this development and began planning special activities to do with David during their time together. They bought age-appropriate toys and books and child-proofed areas of their house to make it safe for an active toddler. They sent photos of their visits showing David laughing and playing, and he always seemed happy when they brought him home. The problems began subtly during David's second year. My parents started making comments about how Elena and I were too focused on worldly concerns like careers and financial success. They suggested that David would benefit from more spiritual guidance and traditional family values. They began bringing religious children's books and toys to our apartment, claiming they wanted to share their faith with their grandson, just as they'd shared it with me when I was young. During one visit, I noticed they'd put a small silver cross necklace around David's neck without asking permission. When I removed it and explained that Elena and I wanted to let David make his own religious choices when he was older, my parents became upset and accused me of denying their grandson access to salvation. They argued that every child deserved to know God from the earliest possible age, and that waiting until adulthood might be too late for his eternal soul. The situation escalated when David developed a minor ear infection that required antibiotic treatment. When my parents learned about the prescription medication, they began asking detailed questions about whether antibiotics were really necessary for such a common childhood illness. They suggested that natural remedies like warm oil or prayer might be just as effective without exposing David to pharmaceutical chemicals. They didn't directly refuse to give him the medication, but their questions revealed that they were still fundamentally opposed to medical treatment. Elena and I had several long conversations about my parents' behavior and decided to reinstate supervised visits until we could be confident they would support David's medical needs without question. When I informed them of this decision, they were furious and accused me of being influenced by Elena's secular education and Nathan's anti-religious propaganda. They threatened to petition the court for grandparents' rights, claiming I was unreasonably restricting their relationship with David based on old grievances rather than current reality. Their lawyer filed papers requesting court-ordered visitation rights just before David's 3rd birthday. The petition argued that my parents had demonstrated years of appropriate behavior and that I was discriminating against them based on their religious beliefs rather than legitimate safety concerns. They brought letters from church members testifying to their character and commitment to following all legal requirements. They also argued that David would benefit from exposure to his cultural and spiritual heritage through regular contact with his grandparents. The legal battle consumed months of our lives and thousands of dollars in attorney fees that we could barely afford on Elena's student loans and my entry-level pharmaceutical salary. My parents had the backing of their church community, which contributed to their legal fund and organized prayer groups, asking God to reunite David with his righteous grandparents. They portrayed me as an ungrateful son who had rejected his family's love and was now preventing his own child from receiving spiritual guidance. During the custody evaluation process, social workers interviewed everyone involved in David's care and reviewed the extensive history of my parents' previous medical neglect. The evaluator was particularly concerned about their comments regarding David's antibiotic treatment and their continued belief that prayer could substitute for medical intervention when necessary. She noted that while my parents had followed supervised visitation guidelines, they had never fully accepted the legitimacy of medical treatment for religious families. Nathan testified about the years of fighting to maintain my medical care despite my parents' religious objections. He brought detailed records of every court hearing, every incident where they'd attempted to undermine my diabetes management, and every example of their continued belief that faith should supersede medical treatment. He explained that while he respected their right to practice their religion, David's safety had to be the primary consideration in any custody arrangement. Elena testified about the ear infection incident and my parents' reaction to David's antibiotic prescription. She explained her concerns as both David's stepmother and as someone studying to become a doctor herself. She described how my parents' attitude toward medication reminded her of the medical neglect I'd experienced as a child, and she worried that history would repeat itself if David ever developed a serious health condition requiring immediate treatment. My parents testified that they had never intended to harm me as a child, and had only wanted to rely on God's healing power because of their deep faith. They claimed they had learned from their mistakes and would never deny appropriate medical care to David. However, when pressed about specific scenarios involving childhood illnesses, their answers revealed that they still believed prayer should be the first line of treatment, with medicine used only as a backup plan if God chose not to heal naturally. Judge Williams, who had handled my original custody case 15 years earlier, reviewed all the testimony and evidence before making her decision. She acknowledged that my parents genuinely loved David and had followed all supervised visitation requirements for over a year. However, she ruled that their fundamental beliefs about medical treatment had not changed sufficiently to ensure David's safety in emergency health situations. She denied their petition for unsupervised visitation and maintained all existing restrictions. My parents appealed the decision and spent another year fighting through higher courts while Elena finished medical school and I advanced in my pharmaceutical career. David grew into an active, curious toddler who loved playing with both his grandfather Nathan and his other grandparents during supervised visits. He had no understanding of the legal battles surrounding his care, only that some visits required a nice lady to sit nearby, while others didn't. When Elena completed her residency in pediatric endocrinology, we moved across the country for her fellowship position at a prestigious children's hospital. The distance from my parents effectively ended their legal challenges since they couldn't afford to pursue custody cases in another state. They were devastated by our move and accused me of kidnapping their grandson to prevent them from having a relationship with him. Their final letter contained threats about pursuing federal charges for parental alienation. David is now 8 years old and thriving in his new school and community. He knows he has grandparents who live far away and love him very much, but he also understands that family relationships sometimes have complicated rules that adults have to figure out. Elena has become one of the leading researchers in pediatric diabetes treatment, partly motivated by understanding how the condition had affected our family. I've been promoted to lead a team developing next-generation insulin delivery systems that could help thousands of diabetic children. Nathan visits us several times a year and maintains his role as David's beloved grandfather figure. At 72, he's slowing down physically, but remains sharp and engaged in David's education and activities. He never speaks negatively about my parents in front of David, but he's always ready to share stories about our adventures together during my teenage years. His unconditional love and support provided the foundation that allowed me to build a healthy adult life, despite my traumatic childhood. My parents still call on David's birthday and major holidays, conversations that are pleasant but carefully supervised by Elena or me. They send cards and age-appropriate gifts that we screen before giving to David. They've never stopped hoping that we'll eventually return to their faith community and allow them unrestricted access to their grandson. They don't understand that the same beliefs that nearly killed me as a child continue to pose risks they're unwilling to acknowledge. Last month, David asked me why I have to give myself shots every day while other dads don't. I explained about diabetes in terms he could understand and showed him how my glucose meter works. I told him about how Uncle Nathan saved my life by making sure I got the medicine I needed, and how some people believe prayer is more important than medicine, but that both can work together. He accepted this explanation with the casual adaptability of childhood and asked if he could help me count carbohydrates at dinner. Looking at my healthy, happy son, I'm grateful every day for the choices Nathan made 15 years ago when he risked everything to save my life. The legal battles, the family conflicts, and the ongoing tensions with my parents are prices worth paying for David's safety and our family's freedom to make medical decisions based on science rather than dogma. Sometimes protecting the people you love means standing up to the people who claim to love you the most. Nathan taught me that real love doesn't require blind obedience or the abandonment of critical thinking. It supports growth, encourages questions, and prioritizes well-being over ideology. That's the kind of love Elena and I are committed to giving David as he grows up in a world where he'll face his own challenges and make his own choices about faith, medicine, and the complex relationship between the two. 6 months later, my parents hired investigators to find our new address and have begun a campaign to regain access to David through social media and indirect family pressure. But that's another battle for another day, and one we'll face with the same determination that has brought us this far.